just in order to kind of try and bring things together, Hida, can we have the questions? So I wanted to remind us of at least two of the questions that framed the day as a whole, and that I asked you, or Maria asked you earlier to think about. Are present-day fascisms aesthetic or emotional in structure rather than fully fledged political doctrines? How to describe the nexuses between art form and the far-right ideologies that take shape under the aegis of neoliberal governance? So these are the questions that really guided kind of the putting together of today, and that brought together the various kind of researches and practices that we have so far seen and also will continue to see throughout the day. You will all have had reasons for coming today and have had particular interests that you will bring into this conversation. And so what I'd really like to do is to try and open it up to that. So this is an opportunity for you to, I guess, kind of, rather than responding to papers, to kind of bring your own questions that might emerge from things outside of the direct discussions that we've had already today. But of course, also for you to kind of begin to think about bridges and links that are going across the various papers that we've had. I'd just like to kind of raise 4 areas that I think seem to be potentially fruitful paths for discussion. The first would be the question of collectivity and individualism. This is something that really appeared in all of the papers. You know, you have the male community of futurism, the fascism without a collectivity of the alt-right, which I think is an interesting proposition. I'm not sure if I totally agree, but that's maybe something to talk about. The cultic milieu, obviously, and then also this question of fragmentation under postmodernism. I think that presents an interesting context for thinking about the collectivity of fascism. Technology, of course. I think technology is perhaps the most obvious strand that's been running through everything so far. Historical precedents. I think there's an interesting thing where when we're talking about fascism, obviously we tend to refer back to the interwar period, and then we talk about now. And that doesn't matter whether we're talking in 2018 or we're talking in 1979. People will still make this connection between the interwar period and whatever is now to them right now. But there's a lot of nows going on here. But at each moment where people discuss fascism, there is a reason for them having returned to this concept. So maybe we need to be thinking more about this kind of continuum between the periods rather than focusing on a kind of beginning and end point of view. The final question is gender and sexuality. I think each of the papers brought questions around the gendering of technology, for instance, or again, coming back to this idea of a male community of futurism that's very specifically male. I think there's more that has been and can be said on the question of gender. So that's kind of four areas of interest. I don't know if any of you want to pick up on any of that immediately, or we just want to see if anyone has their own contribution. Anna, you look poised.
Well, no, I was going to say, well, if nobody has questions, we can... But someone might have a question. No? Well, then I would just like... Oh, okay. There's a question.
I want to know the aspects of identity in this whole thing and belonging, was already mentioned by Morgan. Thank you.
I think this talks, this raises the question of collectivity, perhaps, or the lack of collectivity in the alt-right, but also obviously the cultic and Morgan's question.
I mean, that was what I meant before with this question of like the articulation or the need to rethink the articulation between fascism and collectivities, because of course, like the way the collective is constituted, like under a fascist regime, is always like already predicated on segregation. And I mean, now this returns as some sort of like welfare chauvinism. So basically, like this kind of like surge of AfD in Germany, Front National, etc. It's all about like reclaiming a certain notion of the welfare state, but the welfare state that is only to the benefit of some, and excluding the others. And when it comes to the neo-reactionary movement, then the way this collective is constituted is via a different though intersecting idea of meritocracy. So basically there you have this division between the winners and the losers of the digital economy, and the winners, it's a zero-sum game, so it's a winner-take-all kind of equation. But again, like what you have is the same matrix reproducing itself. So in that sense, I would say that there's a continuity and a discontinuity, between what one could term like, like historical fascism and this kind of like new, like, I don't know, neo-fascist, post-fascism. I'm not so very interested in this discussion about like the designation, like whether you want to term them post-fascist or whether you want to term them neo-fascists. But definitely there is the same type of matrix that gets, again, activated. I don't know if someone wants to add something, maybe Morgan?
No. No? Well, it's difficult to say because a lot of quite complex things are being referenced quite quickly, and I don't want to just jump in and say something that's really general and not
like
very...
I just did, you mean?
No. What you said was really pointed, but I'm sort of... It's hard for me to keep in mind the gentleman who's chair. Apologies, I can't quite remember your name. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Harry.
Yeah, that was just quite a lot of, that was just quite a lot of deep themes that you just pulled out there. But maybe I could try and respond to what the person said in the audience. That seemed manageable and bite-sized. But could you just repeat what she said again? Maybe I could.
The question of identity.
What was the question of identity, though?
How do you constitute a fascist identity? Right? I mean, that's how I understood it, at least. How does a fascist identity get constituted?
Right. Well, I don't. This is the thing. I can't really. Again, I can't say that, but I can speak to like how does any identity get constituted, right? I mean, like me. Maybe I can just talk personally. Like, I like as somebody who, like, I just tend to walk through the world as a consciousness, right? Like, and that is not satisfactory to people. Like every social circumstance I'm involved in, somebody wants to push me into some sort of subject position, and at certain moments I might feel that the discomfort that I experience every time someone tries to push me into a subject position, maybe I might just surrender that and go with one subject position, because you know what, that's easier than having to fight these battles every time somebody says, hey, you're this, or hey, you're that. What I mean by that is that somebody says, oh, you're working class, or you're not working class, you're middle class, or you're straight male, or you're black, or you're not British, you're Jamaican, like, I don't necessarily feel an affinity to any of those things, but they are all a part of how I appear to the outside world, and so have also played a part in shaping who I am as a person, because that's the way people react towards me. But I think this is what I'm saying. I just operate in this space of just general discomfort, where I always feel as if I'm having to negotiate an uncomfortable space between somebody's perception of me and my perception of myself. Now, maybe I'm speculating that for people who may feel a similar sense of like psychic discomfort, that the allure of joining with a group that offers you a singular and consistent identity with a that comes bundled with a heroic destiny awaiting you is going to be really attractive. And I feel like that's the carrot that's dangled in front of people, whether consciously by someone who's grooming you to become a part of a group, or existing as like cultural and symbolic detritus such as in the air that some people can get to grips with online or in books or at concerts. And yeah, for some people, I should imagine that rather than going through this distress and having to like go through every day, figuring out, explaining, trying to assert yourself, it's easier to go in one direction and just say, yeah, that is it. And so I'd imagine the way fascism works is in the same way that I'd imagine that pull towards group affiliation works for subjects just moving through the world.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I feel a little bit like an expert on this subject, being Austrian. We've had a few governments where the far right has participated, and I guess, that makes us a little bit sort of the avant-garde in that subject, the sad avant-garde of the subject. And I guess what I'd like to comment on is the sort of institutionalized fascism. And I think this is something which is really quite an important part of the discussion. What I mean by that is that the far right has very strong institutional setups that work and have always worked, since the post-war period. And they're not even so much secret societies. I mean, some of them are, and some of them fall under the cultic, as you've described them, very much so. Others are, very open, and everybody, well, not everybody can participate, but they're known entities. They are, I would say, on the marginal level of the legal marginalization, but they're sort of fraternities, their balls, their cultural clubs that are in place, and so on and so forth. And maybe just a comment. I mean, we have in Austria just commemorated, I would say, the 80th anniversary of the Anschluss. And there's this sort of, let's say, the myth that the Anschluss kind of happened, in a way through taking over what was the civil society in Austria. But the Anschluss happened way before March 13, 1938, which means that everything was politically in place before the moment of the Anschluss, which means, every museum director had its shadow director, every political person had its sort of shadow replacement. So that, let's say, nationalist socialist government was in place before March 13. And then literally within 24 hours, basically the whole power structure of the country was really converted into a national socialist state. So it's, I think, just as a comment on this idea of institutionalization, and to really not forget to look at these very, very obvious networks of powers that exist.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Definitely, that was that's definitely the case. I would say that you have also nowadays all of these networks in place, and in places where you wouldn't suspect. Like, for instance, BuzzFeed released a huge batch of emails recently, and a lot of things became apparent that a lot of people suspected, but they couldn't prove, or they couldn't really put their finger onto. And one of it was that, for instance, Curtis Yarving was watching the election together with Peter Thiel at his house, and of course that all of these people are very tightly networked. And for instance, also that Bannon is networked with the Opus Dei, and he participated very recently in a conference at the Vatican. So I mean, there is clearly a horizontal and a vertical network. A vertical in the sense of going back in history, because for instance, the Opus Dei was instrumental in the rise of Francoist Spain, and also in Portuguese the Salazar regime. I mean, it has a huge presence in South America, as probably everybody knows. And then also this kind of horizontal network that reaches across the Atlantic, and as I was showing earlier, you now see how the Front National, how the AfD in Germany are taking on the mantle of the American alt-right, and exactly trafficking in the same type of idioms and tropes. But actually, if I may interject? I wanted to address the question of irony too. I don't know if it's a good moment now, because I think that is I mean, this is a fundamental. It's really like I would say where this whole operation hinges is in the strategic deployment of irony. And I also wanted to go back to the question that was asked earlier about like mimicry. So about the strategy, whether it would have been a suitable strategy to mirror the alt-right. And I think that Morgan, since we have Morgan here, could probably comment on that better than I can. But I think that there's a, the transgressive ethos, or this kind of like devocal advocate persona, or like very idea of transgression is of course an artistic genre. And it's very difficult, or it creates a point of intersection precisely between the ethos of the alt-right and the art world that has already been cultivating this type of personas. I mean, at least since like the end of World War II. So I don't want to take over the discussion, so maybe someone else would like to contribute.
Perhaps Giovanna could come in. I wonder how irony works in the case of futurism, though, because that seems like such a significant difference, right? This move from huge commitment to something to an ironic. I think someone used the word dalliance earlier, which I quite liked.
No, actually, yeah. Does this work?
Yes.
Yes. I was thinking, irony makes me think more of someone like Berlusconi, for example. That's really how he established himself through TV. First of all, in the 1980s, that there was this endless spectacle of male power and stereotypes of gender relations, and it was all about irony. But then it worked perfectly, because when he went to power, he came to power with this kind of imaginary that had already colonized, so to say, the country.
Yeah, he's like a hedgelord.
Yeah, so I don't think the future is even though when I read Marinetti's quote, I found it funny also, I mean, the way he writes. But no, I was thinking more about this question of the continuities and the differences between historical fascism and today. And maybe I'd like to expand on what I think Morgan was finishing his one of his responses about artists having this ironical tone, and that they have still an interest in looking like progressive, and because they don't want to look like fascists, because that's not fashionable, of course. And I think this is a very important point, because they don't have to. I mean, the difference between now and the 1910s and 20s is, I think, is that back then capitalism was, as a matter of fact, under threat. There was a revolution that happened in Russia. Another revolution was going on in Germany. I mean, there were uprisings everywhere that wanted to overthrow the capitalist system. So at that precise point, capital established an alliance with the fascist movements. And in the present situation, it doesn't seem that there is such obstacle against capital, against neoliberalism now. I mean, there is no real threat to capital, so they don't need to actually build the same kind of alliance that it was. I mean, I'm really simplifying in a way, but I think that's really a huge difference between now and then. And in the art scene, there is still this idea is that is, if you are an artist, if you are dealing with culture, you're a progressive person. Also because it's part of this situation where you don't need to be a fascist somehow. So I was just thinking about that. Yeah.
Well, if I may just add, I think that, of course, one has to reflect on the question of the media, because the internet does something here. Like, for instance, like this was already way before we were talking about alt-right. There was this, I believe it's called cold law. Like this, basically the observation that when people like troll these groups, like these online forums, like for instance, flat earthers, you know, like a lot of people would just enjoy going to this flat earthers forum and post arguments for the earth being flat. But then, of course, like online, you cannot tell whether this person is being ironic, subversive, transgressive, you know, like affirmational. It's impossible to tell because irony always, it's imperative that you have the presence of the speaker in order to understand whether this comment is ironic or not. And so the effect of it, like the net effect, was that flat earth conspiracies, for instance, just like exploded. And there are now billions of websites and billions of people that actually believe that the earth is flat and like propagate this belief that the earth is flat. And of course, like one can laugh, it's kind of benign, but you know, imagine when this happens with something that is not benign as like believing that the earth is flat, because of course, like what happens is that, sorry, Morgan, you want to say something?
No, I was just, sorry, I didn't realize that I was on speaker. I was just saying, yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So basically what you have is that suddenly you have an explosion of this, PP memes and all of this like alt-right tropes and idioms and, you know, like, etc. And then, I mean, I have to say that I'm really not very interested on I mean, I think it's immaterial whether someone is doing it ironically or, you know, transgressively or sincerely, because what they are doing does something. And what it does is actually it affirms, it somehow, how do you say, builds on, expands, you know, like provides a conduit for a certain ideology, for the normalization of all the chauvinistic epistemes, and yeah, you know, like it has a net effect that is extremely dark, in my view. Oh, you have one, sorry.
We've got a question here, so.
Yeah.
Hi. My question was around what then is or are potential effective strategies that artists or curators or writers can use to confront something which is very, very real and that's happening right now and is escalating. But I just want to provide some context for why I asked the question and just think it through to shape it, because, you know, I find it quite surprising that 5 to 10 years ago, the thinking very much was around how capital, through globalization, was causing immense amounts of damage to different cultural constructs, and that there was beginning of conversation. We could see how, as people in the cultural infrastructure, we were deeply parasitic on these networks. So the rise of biennales, for example, the fact that we can Skype here, the fact that we, as a deeply privileged class, can travel through barriers which have been brought down, and that this was on the back of capital moving and making it much easier for themselves through rent-seeking in governments and corrupt movements in governments, bringing down borders. So the question now becomes, well, but now we live in a very different world after what's happened. And so it's suddenly like, in some way there's some alliance between, and the lack of criticism now of what we used to criticize in globalization, or it's difficult to criticize that now because suddenly you find yourself in alliance with groups on the right, some despicable groups on the right. But has those concerns just gone away? I don't know. For me, it hasn't. A lot of the concerns remain, and when you hear Bannon speak, there's this real sort of disjunct in yourself of like, oh yeah, I do care about rampant capital crossing national boundaries. I do care about how the art world is funded and who from and who's benefited. So what is then an appropriate response, and is mimicry so bad? Or even further, is it so bad to spend time to understand why the Overton window has moved so much and these issues can be looked at? And I can see Morgan sort of smiling behind, so I see the problematics of it, of course, but what do you do with the reality of the situation that's here?
But actually, I don't understand your employment of the term mimicry, because are you saying that the critique of globalization is actually mimicking like Bannon's idea of, or its usage of the term globalists as like a code word for Jews? Because the critique of globalization predates this. It's the other way around. So I mean, one has to be precise about that, right?
No, exactly. But the issue is that there is such a range as well of thinking on the right, and from the centre-right onwards. So there are, what's happened is this, to me it seems, an incredible expansion and okayness of very virulently anti-Semitic, anti any progressive sort of movement on the right. But there are economic arguments that are being made on the right as well, which are alive, and that we were talking about, or certainly I was thinking about, and I'm still thinking through now. And it's like suddenly I find myself allied with, in a way, with rampant capital. And I'm finding that very difficult to deal with.
Well, but this is not a new question. Like already when you had like the protests in Genoa, or you had on the one side this kind of like very chauvinistic groups that were actually all about like. For instance, like this, I forgot his name, but he was a very famous farmer figure that then aligned himself with Le Pen and the Front National. He was a very prominent figure in the anti-globalization protests. So you already had this intersection of as you have now, for instance, in Catalonia with the separatist movement, you have this intersection between people that don't want to be under the monarchy, so basically they are Republicans, and they are very progressive and they are very left, and then you have people that are actually a little bit like Lega Norte, like they are about not paying taxes, like they are about refusing to somehow share their wealth with the rest of Spain. So I think that this is something that I would not frame the way you are framing, because I find the framing already very disturbing. I wanted to say something.
The difference between critique, the work of critique, and ideological discourse, which is not so clear for me in how you're... because if you're assuming that the right wing or that the far right is producing a critique of globalization, I have a problem with that. I think that's not the point. I mean, we shouldn't... I think that now the anti-global or non-global movement is something that comes from the right. I think this is a whole wrong way of understanding the work of critique that we've been doing since 20 years from the left.
Sorry. I suppose all I'd say is just that I don't think Bannon's response to globalization is economic nationalism, which is not, that was not a left solution to globalization. The answers are different. Of course, there's a shared kind of terrain on which people are feeling disillusioned and fed up with capitalism. But this is, this is like, as both of you have just said, this is like not a new problem, and we could look at earlier histories of fascism in the 30s to think through that. And I just would be very wary of giving the ground to the right, in how you frame those sorts of questions. But I understand where you're coming from, but I just think we shouldn't give that ground to them.
Morgan?
I don't know. Yeah, I guess you guys sort of said what I was thinking, really, probably much more articulately. But it's just the same way that you get reports of people wearing Palestinian scarves who are neo-Nazis.
Yeah, right. I was thinking about that exactly.
Yeah, or T-shirts with Che Guevara on them because he's a freedom fighter and they're fighting for the freedom of indigenous European populations. It's just a no-brainer, really, isn't it? No disrespect to the question and that, but. I don't know.
Very, very good. And I think that's why the way I began the question was around form, or coming from form itself, because, and you asked about mimicry, but there's a number of strategies you can use as an artist to deal with oppositional ideas. But to even get there involves, I think, what we've been talking about a lot, which is a lot of research and so on. So sometimes this, this idea of mimicry, there's a huge history that can be talked about. Homi K. Barber's ideas around mimicry. But again, it's the ambivalence and the ambiguity that you sometimes have to deal with, which often you don't want to in the political sphere, which becomes very difficult.
Yeah, but about aesthetics, and now I'm going to employ one of those words that I hate. I think like artists have to unlearn these pop strategies, because of course like we have all been trained to understand affirmation as critique. But this is something that, like right now was completely co-opted by the far right. So of course, like you cannot, it's exactly like the same as like this, the devil advocates persona, or transgression as a genre, or irony, or, all of these forms are not very effective at the moment. So if you actually want to negate the far right instead of affirming its effects, I don't think you can be, I think that mimicry is really not the way to go, because you are really gonna add up, to this. Also, like, I have to say, aesthetics doesn't do that. It's like, for instance, this morning I heard from a lot of people that were together with us, like seeing this exhibition, that there is something about the display, that somehow affirms this ideology, whether or not you wish to criticize it. So like basically there is something about aesthetics that is already in itself very affirmational. You cannot use you cannot really like exhibit something as the critique of that same thing.
It's more than just something that's kind of abstract and tied to aesthetics, though. It's an institutionalization. It's more than something so abstract. It's giving something a very prominent institutional platform, yes, and not necessarily not overlooking the politics purely in favor of the aesthetics. That to me from this morning is perhaps the more dangerous reading of the exhibition.
Yeah, I'd agree with what you just said, overlooking the politics in favour of the aesthetics. What do you think? I'm not directing this at the person who asked the question, but sometimes I'm surprised by people who think if they stage this, that thing Hal Foster, some phrase he used, the only useful one from his book Bad New Days, which was mimetic exacerbation. So if you choose that strategy, why do people think that people are going to encounter an example of mimetic exacerbation in a gallery and suddenly be galvanized to a whole new level of awareness and political engagement? I'm just like baffled that we're still chatting as if that there's some transformative encounter that takes place in front of the work of art. It just doesn't, and I think that's still predicated on the whole history of avant-gardes that are supposedly have like ushered in these revolutions, of which the futurists are responsible as well. It's the same when you listen, you read it about encounters of like Luigi Russolo's noise machines, which like caused people to storm the concert halls where they were performed in. And I came across one actual testimony from somebody who was there at one of those events. She was just like, well, it was just a bit weird. It was these strange machines that were sounded a bit like Hoovers. Everybody sort of walked off. And you're like, yeah, that's what happens. There's no revolution. You just see the work and you're like, yeah, or like... or you're just like, oh, that's a pretty bad piece of work, and so I just think sometimes it's like, just do the work yourself, just do it. If you are concerned with the way fascism is appropriating images or fascism is presenting itself as transgressive, do the work of undoing that. But why choose one of the most ineffective spheres to do it in, which is contemporary art? I know that's kind of a controversial thing to say, but sometimes I just think you have to be honest with yourself. Like, how is it that someone's going to enter into an institution and that's going to be this radical space for ideological transformation? For someone to even recognize it as an attempt to do that, they have to be invested in that discourse anyway. So for you to recognize a presentation a mimetic presentation as undoing itself, you have to understand that's what it's doing in the first place. So what is the point?
I also like to sum up. I think that one has to be very clear that, of course, like criticism is not censorship, as Giovanna recently very brilliantly put in an article. I think that the fact that you are criticizing any kind of artistic position is not a call for censorship.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can I just say something?
Sure.
One of the things, I've got some books out just to remind me. These aren't plugs, or anything, but no, but you know this book.
How much do you get paid by this?
No, come on, that's not it. But in this, so there were a couple of books that came out a while ago that were tracing meme culture, troll culture, and linking that to the emergence of the alt-right. One of them was by someone called Whitney Phillips called This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things. And the other one was by this writer called Angela Nagel called Kill All Normies. And in this book, there seems to be a valorization of transgression. I think someone already mentioned that earlier, like us celebrating transgression as this amazing trope of practice. And I think the problem is, maybe you could say, although there's been some small gains by what you could term, by simplifying, like a left agenda, that's ushered in. Oh fuck! Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. So that's ushered.
You're not supposed to say "fuck" in an institution.
Oh, sorry. You could say that that's ushered in a kind of phase whereby the interests of left groups are experiencing more days in the sun than they were.
Of course you can. The institutions say that you can.
Oh, okay, yeah. So basically what I'm saying is, if you're transgressing now, you're not transgressing from, let's say, the stereotypic image of like the 2.4 children, a suburban American white picket fence. You're transgressing from like gender parity, racial parity, acceptance of like homosexuality, transgender identity. I know these are basic simplifications, but I'm just saying that's why I also think transgression doesn't work as a strategy, because the very things that are gaining space at the moment are the things that were transgressive before. So the only way you're
Well, it's also
not transgression in itself, because look at the futurists, they were totally transgressive. I mean, killed the moonlight, destroyed the city of Venice, everything. I mean, it was just it was all about transgression. But, it was a transgression that had a meaning, which was, to create a new milieu, to use your word, for a new aristocracy of the nation, as I said earlier, a new image of masculinity that could comply with the new conditions of modernity, etc., etc. So transgression can also be used for fascist goals.
No, but that's what I'm saying. If a student at school now is looking at Dada or something, and they're like, "How do I do that?" Like when you first learn about art, you just do that really boring thing of just copying stuff. So you do a couple of collages or something, and you try and you sort of mimic a transgressive position. What would the values be that you're transgressing from? Well, they wouldn't be like the 2.4 children. Maybe they'd be gender parity, racial inclusion, like tolerance about gender and sexuality. That's kind of what I'm saying. That's like a way you'd slip into sympathizing with the alt-right, because you're like, okay, the way I'm dangerous and transgressive is that I'm saying, do you see does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
If I might just add very briefly, we also keep forgetting that there is an economic correlate to transgression, and that's disruption, and that is basically like the social model that is in the process of being implemented. Like this idea of the disruption of all economies by like Silicon Valley overreach. And so basically, on a very fundamental level, this idea of transgression has now completely shifted or slide towards the right-wing spectrum, or the right side of the spectrum.
Can I introduce Matteo into it?
Oh.
Hello. No, I just want to go back to the idea of irony, and that, I mean, etymologically it's about dissimulation. It's this rhetorical figure of pretending ignorance most of the time for the sake of showing an intelligent position in a conversation. But as transgression, these are all strategies, quoting, are being all taken over. I mean, like, when I was researching on populist aesthetics, like some years ago, I was already late doing that, but all the right-wing populist parties from Austria to Italy, they all learned from Emory Douglas. You know what I mean? Like they use the same strategy. So what I want to say, I mean, going back also to this Odin versus chemtrails that was before. Actually, no, chemtrails are getting not only in the European Parliament, the first elected party in Italy, the deputies are all believers of chemtrails, among many other things. And they will block the Parliament discussing this over and over again. So there's one solution is to bring the rationale in front of them, but it doesn't work. Because those are caused by emotions, and in a Spinozian sense, emotions are true. You cannot deny them. You have to engage with them. So that's a little bit going back to how do you create. It's not about strategies. It's not about gaming, but it's more for me about claiming emancipatory practices. And I think, despite what we just said about contemporary art being this little garden of the bourgeoisie, that is true. Most of it is like that. But there's a lot of institutions that are trying to change the way in which their programs are done for different constituencies, that use the space in that radically different ways, and they bring inside the institutions other agendas, other issues, and they're able to really set up new forms of getting together, new forms that I think it's the way in which you engage with new cults, because people will be attracted by other things if you don't create other spaces for them to engage in emancipatory ways. And it's not about strategies, I believe, anymore.
I just wanted to say that probably La Colonia, and I don't know if Kader is gonna speak about that. Is it's one of such experiments to open a different kind of space in a moment of trauma. You know, it was post. After the attacks that the space in Paris was opened last year, so it was really the idea to deal with this political emotion that were captured by the right wing in a different way through La Colonie. So
I just wanted to address this question of the post-fact, because I think that we also tend to lose touch with this scientific dimension, because what Morgan was saying earlier, you know, like chemtrails, you know, like there's a verifiable dimension there. You can actually check whether this is true or not. But one of the points of intersection between far-right ideology and what we call like traditionalist epistemes is precisely like the bell curve, you know, like this very famous book that Charles Murray published. And basically they did a statistical work on what they call the correlation between socioeconomic status and IQ, and then they came to the conclusion that of course whites are you know, like they have a higher intelligence coefficient than other races, except for maybe Asians and I think it was Ashkenazi Jews. And of course, like, I mean, you can also like, you know, like, and I would contest this, you know, like the scientific basis of this thesis, but this thesis is actually the basis for all of this revival of what is now called race realism. So basically, all of this, you know, like new racist dimension in the far right, in the alt-right, in the neo-reaction movement, etc., they all arch back to Charles Murray, and they all revive these studies. And also it was like Steven Pinker who actually popularized this idea that Ashkenazi Jews are more intelligent than others. And of course it sounds benign when you say, oh, you know, they are more intelligent, but you know, like if a group is more intelligent, it immediately implies that another group is less intelligent. So you are actually opening the door, you know, like for all this discussion of like racial difference. And whenever you discuss racial difference, I mean, clearly you are immediately inside this matrix of like superiority and subordination, and you know, like it becomes very, you know, like then it becomes very complicated to disentangle, you know, like the question of discrimination or segregation or apartheid from this question of like difference. And so like I think that, you know, like you really like put your finger to the crux of the matter, which is, I mean, how do you, you know, like how do you deal with the kind of epistemology that brought us here, you know, like, and how does one counter, you know, like all the chauvinism with which it is dripping?
I think we have to bring it to a close there. But I would like to thank Anna, Giovanna, and Morgan so much for 3 fantastic contributions and a wonderful discussion. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thanks.